we ready to start the policy meeting, everybody? Okay. Am I ready? All that talking and I've the wrong meeting up. Second. Okay. I would like to welcome everyone to the policy meeting, August 21st. Getting ready for the new school year, and we will start by asking Ms. Kitten if there's any announcements.
Announcements and a lot of changes. I just want to talk a little bit about what this agenda is going to look like, some of what is changing with the policies. First and foremost, that I asked Christina Gallagher to be here from Whistler because we're talking really heavy legal dependent Title IX changes. So I really wanted to make sure that we had the ability to go through, ask questions, and really get to the heart of the content of these policies. So as you know, there have been many changes to Title IX with evolving guidance, which is why we're here talking about changes that have come into effect on August 1st, on August 21st. But we had the discussion about as long as we were giving our good faith effort and having policies in the revision cycle, that we were all set and good to go. So like I said, I asked Christina to be here. She's going to go over and summarize some of those changes when we get into 103 and 104 for staff and students, so you can have an understanding of what can change, what things look like. She definitely took a look at some of the PSBA recommendations, some of what she was going through with some of her other clients to bring that perspective here. So I think it'll be a really helpful part of the discussion. But the first thing that I really do want to point out is logistically, when we look at these policies, what we're going to be seeing, and this is based on some feedback that Christina will share with you guys as well, we'll see the policy itself, 103 and 104, each will have an AR, so that administrative regulation will have language saying this is when you will follow each one of the attachments below, and what that will look like is non-Title IX complaints, because some things just don't rise to the level of Title IX but still deserve a complaint process. Title IX complaints that come in with the event happening prior to August 1st, 2024, because we have to go by the old regulations if the event happened prior to that date, and then another complaint procedure that I will have to follow as your Title IX coordinator for something that happens after August 1st. So just to keep that in perspective as we go through, we'll evolve and move those ARs around a little bit. So we won't focus too much on those tonight because that is evolving, but we'll really focus on the meat of the policies in 103 and 104. Big reminder that when we go through the PSBA process after this, they will add in all the legal citations during their review. And something that we kept in mind as Christina and I were passing back language recommendations, we really want to keep the ease of reading for this. We want the parent, the student, the staff member who's reading this to be able to access the information in it and have it easy to read and have them understand where to go for problems. So I know that was a long intro, but I think important. So I'm going to pass it to Christina unless you have anything else to say.
Well, we have to do the minutes. Should we do that first?
I'm so sorry. Why don't you run the meeting?
Okay, so before we dive in here, we just have to approve the minutes from June. So I'm gonna look to my committee members. We're good with those? Okay, we'll move those forward to the legislative. And now, back to you.
Okay, now I'll give this to Christina. She'll go over the policies in order that we have them, 103 for students and then 104 for employees, and we'll talk through any of those changes. As always, please give us questions and we'll answer accordingly.
Thanks, Ashley. Again, feel free to shout out with any questions as I'm going through this. Like Ashley said, the big changes here were definitional changes from the new Title IX regulations and definitions within those. But even though it looks like a complete overhaul, a lot of this language was taken from the previous policy as well. So the big changes were adding religious creed, which was a non-Title IX change. That was a new definition in the PHRC guidance, which came out last year. So in addition to this, we're adding some of those definitions. But we added gender identity, pregnancy, childbirth, or pregnancy-related conditions within those protected characteristics. And the other big change was removing the Title IX definitions of sexual harassment. The reason for that is under our new regulations that, again, came out in April. The compliance deadline is August 1st for them to go into effect, for schools to start acting towards compliance. We removed those because those are no longer the definitions of Title IX under the new regulations. So instead, we recommended including those within a Title IX grievance process, which will become an attachment to the AR. So that's a lot of the removal you saw too, were those specific terminologies which are no longer with us because we have the new regulations. That's really just the gist of the policy.
Yeah, so what questions, thoughts, feelings on 103?
Okay, so one of my high-level observations, and that background was really helpful, and maybe it's more in the reporting section. Some of the language in here feels a little more AR-ish to me, but you may tell me, yeah, but there's all kinds of good reasons why you'd want it in your actual policy. You know, and that's not a science, right? What should go in an AR versus a policy, but it just felt like when you're getting into kind of the nitty-gritty about how to report, who to report to, that's typically less, I think, policy language. Obviously, we want to encourage people to report. That's what the policy definitely should say. But I'm just curious, again, how detailed. This is a little more detailed than I would typically think we'd have in the policy document, I guess is the point. But you may tell me that's how it's supposed to be.
Do you have any thoughts on that? Okay.
Maybe I'll keep this on. And it's definitely the policy committee's choice to, if you don't need to include that. That's not a legal obligation. I do believe in the old policy there was some reporting language, so it's definitely, and that I think when in drafting this, I tried to keep as parts of the old policy as well. So that was living in there. But it's.
And I think we'll look to you, Christina, to tell us, hey, legally, this really needs to be in the policy, or your preference. So that's maybe what we'll look to you for.
I was going to agree with you, Jenna. I think what we've been trying to do is that the policy contains sort of the minimal language that stipulates what the board is saying, and the details and implementation go in the AR. In this case, I think I'm happy to have a lot of that move to the AR, especially because, and this is another question, I don't want to derail your time here, but related to this is still in flux, Title IX. And I'm wondering if putting it in the AR is wise just because it's still in flux and it's a lot less painful to change an AR.
I'm going to chime in. I think that's a really good point. We can be a lot more, or at least the administration can be a lot more nimble in the AR. There's, we'd have to go through multiple meetings to make subsequent changes to this. And if it was something we had to move, make a change quickly, that would be, I think that is a good argument for moving more of the detail into the AR. Because we can be more nimble in changing it as, guidance evolves, case law evolves, who knows?
Okay, I'm gonna just give us something to think about that in that context, which is we're trying to make this as easy to find and simple. So that would, in my mind, be a reason to leave it here and have it also be in the AR. We don't want people having a hard time locating the information that they need.
I think that we can accomplish both. So I think that we can kind of make this a little bit more bare bones and put reporting, like who you're reporting to. Details can be found by reaching out to Ashley Kitten, Title IX coordinator, or clicking here on the AR, right? I think we can accomplish both.
I had another question about, and again, this is kind of sprinkled throughout, so I'm sorry I'm not referencing particular paragraphs, but I noticed in a couple places, sometimes we use words like equitable, sometimes we use equal, sometimes we use like. And again, that may be because that's the language we used before, and I think you were trying to leverage our prior language as much as possible. But that may be something we want to look at, and I will say there's also differences, and maybe this is intentional, in that language between the student policy and the staff policy. Like I'll rattle you off one example, and this could be intentional. The very first line of the student policy says we want to provide equitable opportunities. The very first line of the employment policy says we want to provide equal access. So that just may be a global comment to look at that language. Again, this hasn't been reviewed, I don't think, since 2020, so maybe we weren't as careful with our language. Again, I just saw that kind of sprinkled in a couple places, so I figured I'd throw out that global comment.
Okay, so I have a list here. My first comment is, so we're using the word creed, and I'm just wondering, do we need to define that? And also, we use the word color in addition to race. And do we need to define that, or do we need both of those words? And anybody's thoughts about that? Go ahead, Ashley.
I actually was just going to ask if you thought that there was a preference to have those definitions, or those would be things that we would be including in those ARs and grievance procedures, or would that be there?
Yeah, so to address the, we'll just start to the inclusion of race and color were already in the previous policy, so I did not remove any characteristics. Those were all kept the
Okay.
same. We only added on to that.
Okay.
As far as definitions, you're right. All of these terms have legal definitions within various components of the law, not just Title IX. So it would be difficult to define every term, but what we do have to do, what we will be doing in the grievance procedure, that will define the specific Title IX definitions. It won't necessarily define religious creed, or again, these subcategories. You could do that, but I think including all of that may make this very, very text heavy, and these all potentially could, they're legal definitions, so everything is potentially could change, but.
Okay. So we take those one at a time. So religious creed, does anyone think we need that in there? Yeah. Yeah, because creed means I'm thinking of it as like within a religion, the different groups, like Greek Orthodox versus,
That was actually a new definition that PHRC came out with last year, and it was a recommended change by PSBA to have religion and religious creed in there based on those PHRC definitions.
okay. So, Mark, go ahead.
My feeling is if there is a formal legal definition of a term, then having it listed here makes sense to me. Without defining it, or maybe with a reference to the definition, but I agree, I don't want to have a laundry list of all these definitions.
Yeah, I don't think they
that's
are.
not the job of the policy, but yeah, we want to be inclusive of all of the things that have, appeared in various forms of discrimination law, not just Title IX.
So I think that in the next iteration of this, we include everything that legally has to be there. We pull out the extras and we put definition for the legal purpose related to Title IX, related to employment law, related to, so that we're not being exclusive of anything else, understanding that there could be another definition in another realm, but for
Right.
this purpose,
For
this serves that definition. Does that feel good?
Yes, and we're not talking about every word that's listed there. We're just talking about religious creed, right? That's the one.
Well, if you're gonna define that, where do you stop? And I also don't want there to be a feeling of that you have to fit that definition to feel like you are being discriminated against under that. I'm talking myself out of definitions. I'll let you guys talk.
I don't think we need to duplicate explicit legal definitions. And if we did, I would want to do it in the AR because, as one of you mentioned, these are potentially changing as case law develops.
Any other opinions, John?
So I was just looking back and forth between, I think, the student one and the employment one. And I think this only appears in the employment contract one, but it says regardless of actual or perceived. And that language I'm not seeing in the student one. So the actual or perceived, and it has the definitions, which I think actually might sort of speak to, you don't have to define all these things. It's if you perceive you to be in one of these categories, you would then therefore be in that category.
All right, so it sounds like we're landing on not defining these words, at least in the policy, right? Okay. And then, but what about the word color? Do we need that in there? That was just in the last policy and it was kept?
On that global point, my preference would be not to overly rely on what was in the last policy.
Yeah,
Let's just do it right now.
Right, we'll take the list of
Yeah.
things that are legally required to be in here. We'll include legally explicit, and then we'll go from there.
Okay.
That'll be in the next iteration.
Okay. So my next so moving on from that, my next comment is Title IX is listed under the definitions, but I didn't think it was really defined in both 103 and 104. Real definition, I lost my computer.
You mean under the definitions for Title IX discrimination and non-discrimination?
So when you go to definitions, 2.1, sorry, I even wrote it down, 2.1.
That's okay.
Title, it says, it's under definitions, and then, sorry, former English teacher here, but Title IX's in the definition. So, Title IX sex discrimination is defined within federal law and regulation, the districts agree, but the actual definition's not here, it just says where it is. And then it says what the next steps are, but it's not defined.
Do you have an opinion on whether or not this is included here or in, because of that evolving language?
Yeah. You're exactly right. The definition is not in here because there are many components of the Title IX definition, and that's what changed from the 2020 regulations to the 24 definitions. So there's two specific Title IX definitions. One is Title IX discrimination, and one is Title IX sex-based harassment. And those are specifically defined within the grievance process. And we removed the old definitions from the policy because they've changed.
Mm-hmm. So do we take this out of definitions? Like, what's the purpose of this? And where should it go?
I'm fine with it there, especially presumably when this is complete, it will include a reference to the actual definition in a legal document. So, but people may look for it here, and so it's appropriate to have it here so that the link is here. Without actually, the text doesn't need to be here, just need to be a way to find it.
So you're okay, you're saying leave it there, but when we have more information, we change it. That's the intention? Is that what you're saying? No.
I'm not saying change it at all, other than there's references at the bottom, which are links to the various statutes, et cetera, that define these things. And typically we put some of those references in line as well, and we could do that here, and then it makes sense to have the definition here if the link is in line.
And I think if we do include it through that PSBA process, they will include those links. I think here we would absolutely link to the AR and which complaint procedure they would follow, because there will be 3 attached. So we could definitely make sure that those things are linked if we're talking about ease of access. It's simple, it's easy to read, but clicking on this will take you to the correct form. Again, everything will kind of point back to me, but if we're looking at ease of access, that might be the way to go.
We're okay with that? All right. So on policy, in both policies, at 2.2, in the second paragraph, it describes non-Title IX discrimination and harassment. But I guess when I read it, I was wondering if we should use the phrase like somebody was denied access or excluded. So we don't have that there, and I would think that would be a type of harassment. If thoughts on that?
So get me there, maybe say a little bit
Okay,
more.
so it says discrimination as used elsewhere within this administrative regulation and accompanying board policy shall mean to treat individuals differently or to harass or victimize based on a protected classification, including race, color, age, creed, and so on. So what's not listed there that I was looking for as a type of harassment is like denying access to something, like not letting someone be on a team or not letting an employee use something.
Is there something more global than treat individuals differently than you want to use? I mean, I feel like that's pretty global, but if there's something that feels more, or is there any legal language?
Do you want to add more like something addressing specifically an education program or activity? Is that what you're trying to?
I mean, we use that like denied access. We use that language a lot when we talk about, removing barriers for students so that they can do things. So I would think a type of harassment is like that you can't access something that because you're being harassed.
I guess as the Title IX coordinator, I would interpret that to mean that somebody is treating them differently than someone else. You're providing access to this white student, but you're not providing access to this black student, and then conversation ensues. So that's why I mean, does that globally not fit?
Yeah, it's the very first text, the very first thing in the list, it seems to me to cover it.
Okay. So everyone likes it the way it
Again,
is?
if that was a legally defined phrase, I would want to include it, but I don't want to try to enumerate all the possible kinds of harassment or discrimination that may come about, and then we're going to miss one. So that's a rabbit hole that's not wise, I think. But you did point out this text obviously came from the administrative regulation. We're looking at a policy now, so those two should be flipped.
I had the same thing. Yeah, I couldn't figure out why that was, but I think you hit the nail on the head because we lifted this probably from the AR. So what Mark's saying is, so where it says discrimination as used elsewhere within this administration, that should be policy, and accompanying instead of board policy should be AR. While we're on that paragraph, just real quick, the or handicap / disability, somehow it got moved to the end. It should be before. It should come after pregnancy related conditions. See that at the end of 2.2? Sorry, at the end of the first paragraph of 2.2, I should say. Yeah, just somehow it just got moved down, but.
Okay. So still at 2.2, I have, it says harassment is a form of discrimination based on the protected classifications. So then my question is, if someone's being harassed for something that's not part of the protected, do we need to explain it here? So we do explain it in attachment 3, page 5. It says what happens. And there's a definition there. So my question is just, do we need to say it here, or do we like it the way it is? So in
Can you
attachment 3, page 5, there is an explanation of what happens if it's not
Oh, if it's not.
if it's
okay,
not part of
got
a protected class, but it's still harassment.
For something that's non-Title IX.
So that's kind of an important point. This is the definitions. It says harassment is specifically a form of discrimination based on protected classification, which would mean that any harassment and anywhere in this document that's not based on a protected class is not harassment. So this does need to be, it's based on discrimination based on protected classifications or something else if there is some kind of formal harassment that we're talking about that's not part of protected class.
So I can read to you
And I don't know that there is, but.
it says
I don't think there really is, right? I mean, when we're talking about actionable harassment, right? Like, is that,
Is it
for
only,
this purpose, we're just talking about protected class harassment, right? Like,
Correct.
I'm gonna give a silly example. You know, harassing you because you like a particular TV show is not, clearly that's not a protected class, right?
Correct.
That's not what we're talking about here. So should we even be addressing other forms of harassment? I feel like this is limited to protected class harassment.
Okay. But, okay, let me just read to you what it says from this attachment, and that might help explain. So, on the attachment 3, page 5, if the result of this initial assessment determines that none of the allegations fall within the scope of Title IX sexual harassment, but the matter merits review and possible action under the Code of Student Conduct and other board policies, or attachment 2 addressing discrimination complaints, then the Title IX coordinator shall redirect the report to the appropriate administrator to address allegations. So I'm just wondering if that needs to be here.
So that language will exist in the attached complaint processes that will be attached to the AR, much like this one. So when we have those conversations, and we can link to the policy for just employee complaint process, which is independent from this and Title IX. So that will exist, but not in the policy. Does that make sense?
Everyone's okay with that?
I think it might be good to just add like Title IX harassment or, so it doesn't, like to Mark's point,
Right.
it doesn't sound like we're excluding non-Title IX harassment from what we're talking about here.
Do you
Well, this
think,
section is specifically non-Title IX harassment.
and that's a definition that has to be included as part of this process, because there are these grievance procedures that have to follow these things, and there is its own independent process for that, which calls back to this policy. So that does have to exist, but then anything outside of that is just a regular employee complaint is independent from all of this.
So Mary Beth, I'm not sure what you picked up on that I said that sounds like it wasn't included. I would just want to make sure we're including what we need to be including.
Well, I guess the problem is, it says harassment is a form of discrimination based on, but in the real world, like you could be harassed for being short or something that's not a protected class.
So you're not being harassed. It's harassment, you have to, and that's what Jenna was getting at. And that feels really uncomfortable to say out loud, and it's really hard to say to people when they're crying in your office too. You're not being harassed, you're being treated unfairly, and we can go through a complaint process and that lives independently, and you still don't deserve to be treated like that at work, but that doesn't live and exist here. Does that help?
I mean,
Is
do
there
we need to
another policy
define harassment?
I think really the question is there, because, okay, so this policy right now is trying to do two things really. It's trying to do Title IX discrimination specifically, and it's trying to do harassment and discrimination, which are formal terms that are not Title IX. But there's another whole thing that it's not doing, which is the sort of thing you're talking about here. And does that live in some other place? Do
Yeah,
we
the
already
employee
have it?
complaint process. So
Okay.
if it helps you to put it into real live terms, someone comes to me, most often it's not someone quoting a policy to me. Most often it's somebody coming to me or coming to a principal and a principal being trained correctly to come to me and saying, hey, this thing is going on. And me saying, okay, I need to start an investigation to see if it rises to the level of a Title IX. And then we decide, okay, this is discrimination or harassment based on one of these things, but it doesn't really rise to the level of Title IX, so it meets this. Or this is discrimination and harassment based on this, and it does rise to the level of Title IX, so then here are your new set of rules. Or, hey, this is just really mean stuff happening at work or to you at school. This doesn't meet any of this. Here's your employee or your student complaint process, and I'm gonna walk you through all of that as well. So that's realistically how this all works. Does that help?
I'm thinking of like of a bullying situation, that can be, you know, incredibly painful. This kind of says like, no, that doesn't, I guess I want a
So-
definition of
It's not
harassment.
this policy.
So bullying has its own policy, and again, some of them overlap. And a lot of this, and I think this is why I feel so comfortable in an HR world, because so many of our laws and regulations overlap, like leaves of absence and things like that. So for this, it might be me working with one of our principals to say, hey, I have this concern of this bullying thing, and me saying, okay, let's really start this investigation. This might rise to the level of Title IX also, and those two things are running concurrently. He or she is going through the bullying process with said group of students, and I'm also running a Title IX investigation. So they can be both, but they don't have to be.
Maybe it would help if this document were, I'm going to talk myself out of this right now, I think. If this document weren't trying to do two things, if we had a Title IX document and we had a non-Title IX discrimination and harassment document, and we already have separately neither of those,
Bullying, for
bullying, et cetera, document, as opposed to trying to merge these two things together and not that third thing.
I will defer to a much more legal brain than mine. However, this might make everybody feel a little bit better. There are a whole big list of policies that are impacted by the changes that happen in this policy that Dr. Smith and I have just waiting to go over with everybody, that we will start to see that overlap and call back and linked to. So that might make everybody start to feel a little bit better when you start seeing those, which I think will start coming in subsequent months, because I think we need to nail down how we feel and live with this before those changes happen. Does that make sense as well? And I'll defer to you to see if there's anything legally as far as splitting or not splitting.
There's no legal rule like saying you can't do that, but what I will say is that discrimination and harassment are legally defined terms, which is encompassed in this policy. And part of the revisions that we did was to try to simplify this a bit more, to make it very clear that we are dealing with Title IX discrimination and non-Title IX discrimination. And then we're going to have two separate roads that you can go down depending on what kind of discrimination you're dealing with, in the hopes of making it easier for people to understand when they read this, okay, if I'm dealing with an allegation of discrimination, what road can we go down, which will then be attached to the policy. So that was one of the purposes of doing this, was to try to make it simple for the outside world to see when they look at it.
Next one, easy one. It says Director of Special Education a few times. And should that be Director of Student Services?
Yeah, we'll get those corrected.
Okay. Okay, and on the attachment 3, 103 attachment 3, it says the informal resolution process shall be conducted within 5 days or 10 days. Are we supposed to decide that, or is that what is that?
Is that an attachment?
Yeah.
Okay, those will all be in the AR, and those will be the grievance process and procedures, which are legally laid out.
Okay.
Mhm.
So we don't have to worry about that.
Yeah, that's one thing we don't have to decide.
Okay. So this is all based on federal law, right? But what about state law? So I know that we had the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. Like, does that factor into this policy, or is that, yeah? Okay.
Yeah, all those definitions are incorporated within
Okay.
here.
Okay, so we don't need. My next one is for the, how we, the list that we have. So on 103, the race, color, and it goes on and on. It's not exactly the same, and I did provide this to Ashley, as like what we have on 104. So on 103, we say gender identity. On 104, we say gender and gender expression. And then in some of the attachments, which I guess will be updated, it's like there's no gender identity, either one of those. Or in pregnancy, so some of the newer stuff is not there.
And we'll go back through and put in just those legally required. The note that I made about 103 will apply to 104 as well. We'll just get that list of things that are legally required to be
Okay.
in there.
And then they'll all be the same, right? Okay. And then on 103, and this is 3.1.1, it says, even if some of the elements related of the related incident took place or originated away from school grounds, school activities, or school conveyances, it's like still included. But then in the attachments, it very clear, it says it has to have occurred.
The attachments are gone. Forget
Okay.
they exist.
Okay, I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. I promise you.
Okay,
I promise you.
so it is what's in 103 at 3.1.1. That's what it's gonna be. If some of the incidents occurred away from school, it's still part of the investigation.
It could be.
Okay. All right, that was it for my notes. Anyone else? Any other questions? Okay.
I know we were kind of mashing up 103 and 104, but is there anything specific in 104 that we want to talk about? All of the things that we did talk about for 103, I will apply to 104 when I make those changes or when we make those changes.
Yeah, most of the stuff that I saw was in both, like, that we talked about that. Okay. All right, so then I guess, ready to move on to public participation, yeah?
I will ask, I know that this is heavy, these are a potential lot of substantive changes. What does this feel or look like for you guys? We have another policy committee coming up really quickly with the way the calendar worked out. Do we want to just make that an extension, first reads again? I'll let you guys talk about that.
I would do another first reading on this. I think we talked about some relatively substantial moving and changing things around, like, I would give it another first read, personally.
And I feel really good that we can get all of these changes feeling and looking good to a point of everything that we talked about in a 2-week time frame.
Okay. All right, that sounds good. All right, and with that, we will move on to public participation. Speakers are required to state their name and their city of residence or affirm they are a resident or a taxpayer in the district before addressing the board, and you will have 4 minutes. Okay, seeing no one approach the mic, I'm going to close public comment. And with that, our next policy meeting is Wednesday, September 4th, coming up soon, 7 p.m., or immediately following the Education Committee. We are adjourned.